There is a myth that history belongs only to kings, nobles, and knights, the armored giants who thundered across battlefields and seemed invincible. For generations, their power went unchallenged, their authority unquestioned, and their presence seemed eternal. Yet history is full of moments where the impossible became reality, when ordinary men rose from the shadows to defy the strongest powers of their age. Not with crowns or castles, but with unity, desperation, and courage born out of relentless suffering. This is one of those moments. The story of how humble farmers, craftsmen, and merchants stood against the most powerful knights of France and rewrote the balance of medieval warfare forever. For centuries, knights had reigned supreme. They were not simply soldiers, but symbols of dominance, moving fortresses of iron and steel. Clad in layers of armor, astride towering war horses bred for combat, they embodied the ultimate weapon of the Middle Ages. From childhood, they were trained to fight, kill, and command. In battle, a single knight could turn the tide, often said to be worth 10 ordinary infantrymen. Their charges shattered enemy lines like thunder breaking the sky, their lances piercing through multiple men in one strike. To face them was to face a living machine of destruction, and more often than not, their enemies fled before the clash had even begun. Yet for all their fearsome power, the knights and their noble masters overlooked one timeless truth. When human beings are pressed beyond survival, when there is nothing left to lose, they become far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. Life for peasants in the medieval world was a life of relentless hardship. They were bound to the land, working from sunrise to sunset just to scrape together enough to survive. They carried the crushing weight of taxation imposed by lords who saw them as little more than beasts of burden. Their homes were little more than hovels, often shared with livestock. Their families plagued by hunger and disease that swept away children in numbers unimaginable today. Famine lingered always on the horizon, striking whenever crops failed, and death was an everyday companion. Oppressed, ignored, and broken by centuries of exploitation, these men and women endured lives that would seem unbearable to us now. And yet, it was from this deep suffering that defiance was born. The first cracks in knightly supremacy appeared not on some distant frontier, but in the heart of Flanders in the early 14th century. Count Louis of Nevers, who ruled the region, pressed his subjects beyond endurance with his suffocating taxes and pro-French policies that strangled their economy. What began in October 1323 as small, scattered riots across the countryside soon gathered force, escalating into something far more dangerous, a unified rebellion of common people that would shake Flemish society for nearly 5 years. At the heart of this uprising stood Nicholas Zanneken, a wealthy peasant farmer who understood that anger alone could not topple knights. Mob violence would never hold against armored cavalry. What was needed was discipline, planning, and unity. Under his leadership, ragged groups of farmers and artisans were forged into something resembling an army. They captured major towns, including Newport, Ferney, and Rousselard, transforming their rebellion into a true political force. Unlike earlier revolts, they did not simply burn and vanish into the countryside. They held ground, governed territory, and established their own order. They proved, perhaps for the first time, that common people could seize control of their own destiny. Yet the true measure of their rebellion was not in captured cities, but on the open battlefield. The moment of reckoning came on July 11, 1302, at a place that would forever be remembered as the site of the Battle of the Golden Spurs. There, on the fields outside the Flemish town of Kortrijk, An army of common men faced the might of France. King Philip IV had raised a formidable host, some 8,000 troops, including 2,500 heavily armored knights and men-at-arms. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the finest of the French nobility, the cream of chivalry itself, equipped with the most advanced weapons and armor wealth could provide. Facing them stood about 9,400 Flemish militia, craftsmen, weavers, merchants, and farmers, most of whom had never marched in a proper army, let alone stood in battle. By every calculation, by every military standard of the age, the Flemish should have been destroyed before the day was out. The French knights were arranged in 10 squadrons of 250 horsemen each, supported by crossbowmen and infantry. Their plan was brutally simple, the same plan that had shattered countless peasant forces before. Bombard the enemy with bolts until their lines faltered, then launch a devastating cavalry charge to smash them apart. It was a formula that had worked for centuries, and the nobles saw no reason it would fail them now. But the Flemish were prepared. Zannekin and his men had chosen their ground carefully, fighting not on open plains, but on marshy fields cut with streams and ditches. To a knight, these obstacles were traps. The heavy war horses would sink and stumble, their charges broken before they could even land. And then there was the weapon of choice, the feared Guten Dog. Despite its deceptively pleasant name, meaning good day, this was no friendly greeting. It was a thick wooden staff, tipped with a deadly iron spike. In the hands of determined townsmen, it became a brutal tool, designed to stop a horse dead in its tracks, or to drag a knight from his saddle and finish him on the ground. The battle opened as expected. French crossbowmen advanced, unleashing volleys that pushed back the Flemish skirmishers. Light infantry pressed forward, hacking at the peasant lines, and soon it seemed as if victory for France was inevitable. But then came the decision that would alter the course of history. Count Robert II of Artois, leading the French forces, ordered his infantry to withdraw. His reasoning was not tactical but cultural. To him, it would have been dishonorable to let common infantry carry the day. True victory, in the eyes of medieval nobility, belonged only to knights. That single act of arrogance, born from pride and the rigid codes of chivalry, would become the turning point of the entire engagement. As the French cavalry thundered across the marshy fields of Flanders, the ground itself seemed to betray them. What had begun as a display of perfect formation, of discipline and unstoppable might, quickly unraveled into disarray. Horses stumbled as their hooves sank into the wet earth, riders were separated from their units, and the cohesion that had long been the pride of French knighthood began to collapse before it ever reached the enemy. What was meant to be an unstoppable charge became a disorganized melee, and in that moment, centuries of noble dominance faced its first real test. The Flemish militia, far from panicking as peasants often had in battles past, stood their ground with a calm determination. They did not scatter, they did not flee, and they did not cower before armored lords on horseback. Instead, they held firm, ready to exploit the chaos of the broken charge. One by one, knights found themselves isolated, surrounded by common men wielding weapons crafted not in royal forges, but in barns and fields. Every swing of a flail, every thrust of a pike sought the vulnerable joints in plate armor. The very equipment that gave knights their confidence now became their trap. The battlefield transformed into a brutal proving ground, and the myth of knightly invincibility began to unravel. That day, the Flemish militia lived up to their fierce reputation. The French nobility fell from their horses like toppling towers, their heavy armor dragging them down into the mud. Once on the ground, they were no longer untouchable figures of power, but men vulnerable to the unrelenting blows of the fighters surrounding them. The clash of steel on steel echoed across the marsh, joined by the cries of war horses and the desperate shouts of those who had realized too late that their supremacy was crumbling. In the span of only 3 hours, the impossible had taken place. Dozens of French lords, the pride of their nation's nobility, lay defeated in the muck. Their golden spurs, symbols of their exalted status, were torn from their boots and collected as trophies by the victorious peasants. By the end, 500 pairs of gilded spurs had been gathered, each one marking the fall of a knight who would never again ride into battle. Guy of Nemours, the Flemish commander, ensured the victory carried a message as chilling as it was revolutionary. His command was simple: noble privileges no longer applied. There would be no mercy, no ransoms, and no exceptions for bloodlines or titles. For once, the lives of nobles were worth no more than the lives of peasants. The result was a collapse unlike anything France had seen before. Knights who had managed to survive fled in panic, abandoning their foot soldiers to be cut down by the militia. The very backbone of French military pride, the knightly class itself, had been shattered by farmers wielding farm tools. When news of the battle spread across Europe, it sent shockwaves through every royal court and noble household. If Flemish weavers and farmers could stand against the might of French knights, then what was to stop peasants elsewhere from daring the same? The very foundation of feudalism, the belief that nobles were inherently superior in battle and ordained by divine right to rule, cracked in a single afternoon. And what the peasants of Flanders had begun, others would learn to perfect. In Bohemia, a visionary leader named Jan Žižka understood the deeper meaning of that Flemish victory. He saw why peasant rebellions had failed in the past. Too often they relied on raw fury and chaotic uprisings rather than discipline and strategy. Žižka transformed that understanding into action. He imposed strict discipline on his Hussite army, where disobedience was not tolerated, and every fighter was drilled with precision. He armed them not with traditional knightly weapons, but with tools adapted from daily life. Green flails became deadly spiked weapons capable of crushing armor, while pitchforks were reforged into pikes long enough to pierce through mounted cavalry. Most revolutionary of all, his forces created the world's first organized use of war wagons, mobile wooden fortresses that could lock together into instant defensive walls, turning the battlefield into a fortress of their own making. Cavalry, once supreme, now found itself powerless against ingenuity. These lessons spread rapidly, igniting new sparks of rebellion across Europe. Peasants began to realize that they did not have to endure oppression silently. In England, the revolt of 1381 became a symbol of this awakening. Common people marched on London itself, even storming the Tower of London and executing figures of authority who had once seemed untouchable. Though the uprising was ultimately crushed, it forever ended attempts to reimpose full serfdom. The psychological shift was permanent. Once peasants understood that power was not divinely fixed, the rulers of Europe could never again rely solely on fear to hold them in check. What terrified the nobility most was not simply that they could be defeated on the battlefield, but that the myth sustaining their dominance had been destroyed. For generations, knights had been seen as God's chosen warriors, invincible and sacred in their calling. But the battles of Courtrai and the Hussite Wars tore away that illusion. The fear that had once kept peasants obedient was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous to the ruling class: hope. Contemporary chronicles describe nobles retaliating with shocking brutality, burning villages and punishing populations in a desperate attempt to restore their shattered reputation. But the truth had already escaped into the minds of millions. Knights were mortal. They could fall. They could die, just like any other man. The cost of maintaining them, war horses, armor, years of training, suddenly seemed like wasted gold when compared to the devastating efficiency of disciplined peasants with simpler weapons. The economics of warfare had shifted, and with it, the very structure of society. The great battles of Crécy and Agincourt in the following century confirmed the new reality. English longbowmen, ordinary men armed with bows, cut down wave after wave of French knights with terrifying precision. The age of the mounted knight was ending, replaced by the rise of professional infantry and organized armies. But the true revolution was not found on the battlefield alone. It was found in the social order of Europe. These victories proved that common people could organize, could govern themselves, and could wield power independent of the nobility. The 500 Golden Spurs taken at Courtrai became more than just trophies. They were symbols of a new truth. Birth and bloodline no longer guaranteed supremacy. Determination, unity, and discipline could triumph over privilege and tradition. The descendants of those Flemish peasants went on to build one of Europe's wealthiest trading regions, prospering through commerce instead of conquest. In the end, the peasants of medieval Europe had done more than resist oppression. They had rewritten history itself. They showed that tyranny plants the seeds of its own destruction, that no fortress is impenetrable, and that the true strength of a society lies not in the hands of the few who claim to rule, but in the many who dare to resist. And so, when one hears of underdogs facing impossible odds, it is worth remembering those farmers of Flanders. Standing in the mud, facing down the thunder of armored cavalry, they had every reason to run, every excuse to surrender. Yet they did not. They stood firm. And by doing so, they proved that even the mightiest can fall, and that history itself can be changed by the courage of the common man.